Good morning.
Good morning.
And welcome to All Souls Church on this fill in the blank as to what you want to call the day. And we appreciate your attendance because obviously many of us could not make it today. And I'm not Gene Patterson either. My name is Bill Strimsher. I'm filling in for Gene today. One thing we really appreciate, especially on a day like this, is visitors. Do we have any visitors today? If so, we'd like it if you could stand and introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and maybe even why you came here. Any visitors or members who have visitors with them? Bill? Great. Good to have Bill's mom here today. Welcome. And here's over here.
Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good to have you. And Carol's has, here's some back here. Okay. Wonderful. Good to have you with us today. This is better than I expected. Very good. Let's see. If you came for the burning of the goats, that has been moved to next Sunday. If you don't know what the burning of the goat is, ask somebody. Anything else I need to say?
No, we're good.
I think we're good. Okay, thank you for being here.
Good morning, and again, thank you for making it here over the snowy streets. It's good to see all of you. We've shifted this morning and will not be presenting the auction sermon because we wanted to make sure that the buyer and other folks who've been looking forward to it could be here. And so we'll be doing that service with the choir in 2 weeks. Today will be a reload, as they call it, of a service from a couple of years ago in celebration of the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which will be on Tuesday. So come and let us reason together. Come and let us reflect together on the heritage of the past, on the demands of the present, and on the possibilities of the future. Today, on this snowbound Sunday, we pause to remember once again the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who once called our nation to account for its oppression of our Black fellow citizens. Speaking of the demands upon the human spirit in his own time, Dr. King wrote this: "Courage faces fear and thereby masters it. Cowardice represses fear and is thereby mastered by it. Courageous persons never lose their zest for living, even though their life situation may be zestless. Cowardly persons, overwhelmed by the uncertainties of life, lose the will to live. We must constantly build dikes of courage to hold back the flood of fear." Even today, more than 50 years after his martyr's death, our communities still founder in the flood tides of fear and violence. Let it be here. Let it be now. Let it be us who build again and again the dikes of courage and of reason, so that the ideals of equal justice, of liberty and human kinship may stand firm, guiding us forever onward to a better world, so that there may truly be liberty and justice for all, so that every person, every child of the earth may affirm that we are finally free at last. May the light and warmth of our chalice flame call us persistently to that justice and that freedom which is forever unfolding in our world and in our lives. Darla?
Good morning, my name is Kenny, and I like this challenge for a free and responsible search for truth and meaning.
Oops. Thank you, Jenny. Good job. Now let's rise together as you are willing and able and speak once again the words of our community's covenant. Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Now today we're going really old school, so I need you to turn in your hymnals to hymn number 1. What, really? Oh, well done you. Okay. Well, what's hymn number 104, and it's verse 1 and 4. As we take our seats, I'm going to invite you to turn to someone nearby, preferably someone you didn't come in with, and just share a little bit about what the impact of this storm has been on you and your family. And also, let's share a moment of gratitude for Derek Westra and his father, Matthew, who got here early and cleared our sidewalks. And extra points if the person you talk to is under 20. So how's for you?
Well, I haven't had any problems. I
Really?
lost power or anything.
Wow.
I lived a distance out. I wasn't sure I could get here.
Right.
The highway was clear.
Good.
My little town, that was a problem, and getting in the city was a problem.
Yeah.
Other than that, I have nothing to complain about.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, our power's out.
Your power, I heard from how.
Well, it went out just before the Chiefs game started at about 3 o'clock.
Good to know.
So fortunately, our neighbor invited us over to watch the game because he has a generator, although he had to go out at halftime and get more gas for his
generators.
And then it went back on right about the end of the game, so that was great. We went home, we had dinner, and then maybe about 8 o'clock, I heard the thing blow. What do you call that thing? But yeah,
on the pole.
right, exactly. So then it was out all night, And which it was manageable, except I didn't have anything to dry or curl my hair, so I ended up bringing my curling iron to church on the theory that there would be power here. And I was
all night with no power.
Yeah, no. Well, fortunately we have a gas fireplace, so we were able to leave that on, and that did us. All right, so technical consultation here. Do we have the responsive reading on the screen? We do. All right. Hey, let's hear it for our tech people. There, really. So these are the words of Martin Luther King, and your response will be up on the screen, yes? Okay. So, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. Hatred and bitterness never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds, which precipitate and perpetuate war. One day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal for us, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. We shall view out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. And now to introduce our offering, Marty Kerr. And friend.
You'll cry and whimper, you know, friend. Friend might be. There you go. Thank you. I'm Marty Kerr. I'm a member of the church, and this is my friend Harry. I didn't bring him up here to show him off, but if I left him back there, he'll cry and whimper since he's very spoiled. So anyway, Reverend Gibbons honored me with the opportunity to do the invitation to the offering today. It was in good part because I have a son who is incarcerated, who has been in federal prison now for almost 15 years. He is, and a member of this church. In fact, Kyle was really the one who got me to come here some 18 years ago. So I am familiar with the subject matter of the offering today, which is to the CLF prison ministry. For those of you who may not be totally familiar with that organization, it is a part of the, obviously, the Unitarian Church. It is the congregation of the large fellowship, which is in Boston. And its primary purpose is to administer liberal religious services to inmates in federal and state prisons and city jails across this country. As a father of someone who's been in that system for many years, I can state to you that the normal traditional situation in prisons for one who may be seeking spiritual support or growth is quite limited in that Christian evangelical ministers mainly provide these services in our prisons. And while that may be okay for some people, what you see happen is that in most institutions, that offering of that particular type of religious dogmatism ends up that it's very networked with the prison administration, with the prison chaplain, and you have a system that really can be very punishing to those even who do not want to partake of those services, which tend to be very proselytizing. And my son has run into, over the years, situations where not only was he not welcome with some of his questioning and religious background here, but ended up being administratively sanctioned in some ways. Some subtle, some not so subtle, particularly down in Oklahoma where he was at one time. So this kind of an opportunity for inmates of all genders is of extreme value. It provides prison visits to those in need. It provides a pen pal program, as well as post-incarceration support for those who need it. Prison is, the demographics there are very similar to what we have on the outside here. There is a good portion of those who would classify as nuns, in that they don't believe or question, really not sure what their spiritual beliefs are. There is little or no opportunity for those people who might seek spiritual support or learning without such a program as this. So it does offer the inmate a genuine chance for spiritual growth, education, learning, and to even express concerns and inquiries and even disbeliefs, which, as we know in this congregation, that is so valuable and one of the primary reasons that brings us here to this church. So I would heartily recommend an offering today to this valuable organization. I think it represents one of our highest ideals as a congregation, to express today our willingness to reach out to those who are some of our most vulnerable and isolated, as they too seek spiritual support and meaning and purpose to their lives. And by doing this, I think we fulfill part of our covenant by doing that today. So I'd urge you to give an offering today. It's the checks should be made payable on the memo line to CLF Prison Ministry for that to go to that organization. And as I understand, is all the cash? Half the cash. Okay, half the cash that's given today will go to that organization also. So I urge you to do that. So at this time, let's hope that we generously give, as I know it will be generously and thankfully received. Thank you.
Will you join me in the words of dedication for our offering? And at this time, I invite our readers to come forward. Together we say, we dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society. We begin with words from the writings of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
It is time that we stopped our blithe lip service to the guarantees of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These fine sentiments are embodied in the Declaration of Independence. But that document was always a declaration of intent rather than reality. These were slaves when it was written. There were still slaves when it was adopted, and to this day, Black Americans have not life, liberty, nor the privilege of pursuing happiness, and millions of poor white Americans are in economic bondage that is scarcely less oppressive. Americans who genuinely treasure our national ideals, who know they are still elusive dreams for all too many, should welcome the stirring of Negro demands. They are shattering the complacency that allowed a multitude of social evils to accumulate. Negro agitation is requiring America to re-examine its comforting myths and many yet catalyze the drastic reforms that will save us from social catastrophe.
Nelson Mandela served over 27 years for opposing apartheid in South Africa. The following comments and reflections on prison are found in Conversations with Myself by Mandela.
From a speech at his co-defendant's trial in 1964, in which sentencing choices were between the death penalty and life in prison. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to the struggle. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against Black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal with which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if need be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
After receiving a life sentence, he was transferred to Robben Island, about which he said, "The first Black hero to be banished and confined to Robben Island was Atshimayu. He was banished at the end of the 1658 war between the Hoi Hoi and the Dutch, and the first and so far the only person to successfully escape from the island. Robben Island, a one-time leper colony, a Second World War naval fortress guarding the entrance to Cape Town Harbor, a tiny outcrop of limestone, bleak and windswept and caught in the wash of the cold Benguela current, whose history counts the years of our people's bondage. It was my new home."
In a letter dated 8/1/1970 to an attorney who was a senator in Swaziland, a friend who had once upon a time read for the law in Mandela's law offices, Mandela wrote from prison, "The anchor of all my dreams is the collective wisdom of mankind as a whole. I am influenced more than ever by the conviction that social equality is the only basis of human happiness. It is around these issues that my thoughts resolve. They are centered on humans, the ideas for which they strive, on the new world that is emerging, the The new generation that declares total war against all forms of cruelty, against any social order that upholds economic privilege for a minority and that condemns the mass of the population to poverty and disease, illiteracy, and the host of evils that accompany a stratified society.
About government and prisons, in a letter to the prison commissioner on April the 22nd of 1969, he wrote, "The government regards the prison not as an institution of rehabilitation, but as an instrument of retribution, not to prepare us to lead a respectable and industrious life when we're released and to play our roles as worthy members of society, but to punish and cripple us, so that we should never again have the strength and courage to pursue our ideals. This is our punishment for raising our voices against the tyranny of color. This is the true explanation for the treatment that we receive in prison."
On the subject of things he learned in prison, he said, "There was a policy of the government which was ruthless and very brutal, and you have to go to jail to discover what the real policy of a government is, behind bars. But at the same time, one immediately discovers that not all prison officers are beasts. Of course, that is the main policy, and the average warder is a brutal man. But nevertheless, there were good fellows, human beings, and who treated us as, human beings. And you found, the resistance, the ability of the human spirit to resist injustice right inside the prison. And you learn you don't have to have an academic degree to have the qualities of a leader, the qualities of one who wants to fight against injustice wherever it is found."
If color blindness is such a bad idea, though, why do we have people across political spectrums who become so attached to it? For conservatives, the ideal of color blindness is linked to a commitment to individualism. In their view, society should be concerned with individuals, not groups. Gross racial disparities in health, wealth, education, and opportunity should be of no interest to our government, and racial identity should be a private matter, something best kept to ourselves. For liberals, the idea of color blindness is linked to the dream of racial equality. The hope is that one day we will no longer see race because race will lose all its significance. In this fantasy, eventually, race will no longer be a factor in mortality rates, spread of disease, educational or economic opportunity, or the distribution of wealth. Race will correlate with nothing. It will mean nothing. We won't even notice it anymore. Those are the idealistic embrace colorblindness. Those who are less idealistic embrace colorblindness simply because they find it difficult to imagine a society in which we could see race and racial differences, yet consistently act in a positive, constructive way. It's easier to imagine a world in which we tolerate racial differences by being blind to them. The uncomfortable truth, therefore, is that racial differences will always exist among us. Even if the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration were completely overcome, we would remain a nation of immigrants and indigenous people in a larger world divided by race and ethnicity. It's a world in which there is extraordinary racial and ethnic inequality, and our nation has porous boundaries. For the foreseeable future, racial and ethnic inequality will be a feature of American life. This reality is not cause for despair. The idea that we may never reach a state of perfect racial equality, a perfect racial equilibrium, is not a cause for alarm. What is concerning is the real possibility that we as a society, will choose not to care. We will choose to be blind to injustice and the suffering of others. We will look the other way and deny our public agencies the resources, data, and tools they need to solve problems. We will refuse to celebrate what is beautiful about our distinct cultures and histories, even as we blend and evolve. That is the cause for despair. Seeing race is not the problem. Refusing to care for the people we see is the problem.
The thing that is necessary to remember is that pathology can be produced. Rats, for instance. Rats are an intelligent, adaptive, prolific species, smart enough to have figured out how to take advantage of their environment, the one created by human civilization, for the purpose of their own thriving. They have moderately complex and reasonably ordered patterns of social interaction. They have many natural predators, their main defense being fecundity. In normal circumstances, rat mothers raise many litters of young with efficient care. All other things being equal, a rat is a perfectly nice, ordinary creature, part of the interdependent web of all existence, an expression of the life of all that is. Nothing inherently wrong with rats. And yet, as the scientist John B. Calhoun demonstrated in his now famous experiments at the National Institutes of Health in the early 1960s, when they get too crowded, rats go nuts. In a situation where a colony of rats has reproduced beyond a certain density in a confined setting where none of them can leave, rats become socially dysfunctional. Some become selfish tyrants. Others form violent gangs. They engage in rape without regard to gender and cannibalism. Females in these settings rarely achieve pregnancy or carry to term. If they do give birth, they abandon or attack their pups. Some become catatonic, withdrawing from all activity and social function. Ultimately, under the combined impact of fatal violence, reproductive failure, infant mortality, and psychological disintegration, the colony does not just fall back to a sustainable population for the space, it goes extinct altogether. There's nothing wrong with these rats to begin with. The problem is not their being rats. It is the inescapable crowding that is imposed upon them. They become pathological. Their pathology is produced. The publication of Calhoun's experimental results brought forth a vociferous and sometimes heated debate about their applicability to human conditions. we to understand that overcrowded cities were responsible for pathological behavior among their human citizens? How should we make sense of highly concentrated communities of privileged people who did not become dysfunctional? Or does privilege serve only to disguise the dysfunction that is really there? Or is what rats do irrelevant to what humans do? It is not my intention to enter into that conversation this morning. The only moral that I take away from what Calhoun called the behavior sink into which the rats predictably fell is that pathology is not always random or arbitrary. It can be produced. I emphasize this principle as we turn our attention once again to the anniversary of the birth of America's moral hero, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the recognition of his legacy to which that celebration annually calls us. As religious and social progressives, we are aware that it is not enough to admire and affirm what Dr. King and his followers achieved in their lifetimes, astounding as those changes were. Without them, we would not have had Barack Obama in the White House, nor many of the landmark accomplishments of legal and social justice that have unfolded within the historical experience of many of us in this room. Nevertheless, as Dr. King made clear before his death, there is a great deal, a very great deal of work that remains to be done. The racial privilege upon which this nation was founded has not been dismantled or repented of. It has only become less crude, less overt, less easy to name and resist. Let me confess to two significant realities about my own life and learning in this area, so that you will understand that I am in no position myself to offer counsels of perfection. First of all, I benefit from the conventions of white privilege that structure our national and indeed international culture. In a few ways that I notice, and in many ways that I do not even see, my life is easier, safer, and more fulfilling, not because of anything that I have earned, but because I was born white. There is no meaningful way in which I can renounce this advantage, even if I truly wanted to. And I have but little confidence that if it were possible, when it came to the point, I really would give it up. The second confession is that unlike my parents' generation, including Dr. King, I do not know how to fix this dilemma. I have not been able to discover or imagine a path that could lead our society to the place of ongoing justice that both remedies history and practices equality of opportunity in the present day. I am persuaded that our current legal, economic, and social structures do not offer equal justice, that both power and opportunity remain significantly stratified by race in American culture, and that popular energy to maintain this disparity is stronger than the energy for changing it. There are those who claim that only a complete revolutionary restructuring of our entire Western capitalist Enlightenment system will accomplish the necessary change, while my own historical perspective leads me to regard such an ambition dubiously. Yet I cannot argue that the incremental remedies I have seen achieved in my lifetime, although they are not insignificant, even begin to approach a sufficient transformation in this enduring evil? What the answer is at this point, I do not know. And it seems to me that to acknowledge that ignorance is essential to any progress. It would be one thing to recognize that what needs to be done now will be very difficult or unpopular or time-consuming or dangerous. Challenges like that have been undertaken before now, and some victories over the long term have been won. But these have had envisionable goals: end slavery, gain voting rights, outlaw legal discrimination, increase minority representation in schools and trades and public service. The underlying struggle for the conscience of American society is not so easily benchmarked. And racism is a mutating virus that changes with its host only to reappear in unpredictable forms. When the institution of chattel slavery could no longer be maintained, the system of Jim Crow restrictions on Black individuals and communities quickly encoded existing white privilege and perpetuated it in law and custom. When that system was challenged and its legal sanctions overturned, it seemed as though there would be no more place for racist impulses and structures of white privilege to find political and legislative coercive power. Exposed to the light of public opinion as personal prejudice without legal enforcement, such ideas, it would hoped, would wither of their own falsity and injustice. That's what we thought. But we reckoned without the adaptability of the virus of racism. It is helpful to understand that racism likes to appear rational. As far back as slavery, it sought to justify itself by appealing to studies like those of Samuel Morton, who calculated the capacity of white and Negro brains by measuring the amount of lead shot that various skulls could hold. The Swiss naturalist and Harvard professor Louis Agassiz popularized the work of the French aristocrat Arthur de Gobineau, tracing the origins of what he determined were the various uniquely created races which were never intended to interact. Today, such pseudoscience has been discredited. But remember that pathology can be produced. What followed the legal dismantling of the racist Jim Crow cultural consensus was America's sudden appeal to law and order, and an astronomical increase in the incarceration rate among Black citizens, especially young men. The majority of restrictions imposed on Black communities by legal forms of discrimination before the 1950s in housing, employment, voting, education, and economic opportunity are still mandated with an untroubled social conscience against anyone identified as a felon. While the population of actual prisoners has indeed skyrocketed since Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, it is not necessary that Black people actually be in prison. The deprivations of meaningful citizenship apply once they have ever been in prison for the rest of their lives, whether or not they are ever again in trouble with the law. This reconfiguration of the dynamics for racial control began during the Civil Rights era, even before the battles of legal integration were fully won. Where once leaders of government and public opinion had openly defended racial segregation as essential to preserving the social status quo, They started instead to attack the presence of outside agitators, such as Martin Luther King, who disrupted cities and communities by engaging in illegal activities like marches and boycotts. A return to law and order became code language for ending such civil demonstrations, and thus implicitly the pressure for change among Black activists. Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty was countered by Richard Nixon's call for a war on drugs, and it was the latter which captured the popular imagination and the legislative agenda of the 1970s, culminating in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. The appearance of crack cocaine in 1985, together with the globalized outsourcing of most blue-collar manufacturing jobs, devastated poor Black neighborhoods and gave some facade to the anti-drug agenda, as Black residents trapped in the ghettos frantically sought to preserve their communities. This justified an increase in federal spending on anti-drug enforcement from $157 million in 1981 to $2.25 trillion by 1991, while research, treatment, prevention, and education funding fell from $288 million to $60 million during the same period. These kind of shocking statistics can be piled up to the point where you can't take them in anymore. Let me offer you just one other. It struck me because 1972 was the year I graduated from high school. That year, there were approximately 350,000 men and women in prison in the United States. An average of about 7,000 per state, though, of course, obviously not that evenly distributed. Now, 350,000 ruined lives is still a tragedy. But you can wrap your mind around that number. It's about 2 reasonable-sized community colleges per state. A state might actually be able to grapple with that, to think intelligently about how to help those people, attend to their physical and mental health needs, make sure they have some life skills, motivate them to be productive citizens in the future. A state might responsibly take that many people's well-being into its own hands by force. Do you have any idea what that number is today? It's over 2.2 million, and 60% of them are Black or Hispanic. Moreover, another 5 million adults are on parole or probation, as well as 70,000 juveniles in detention, putting over 3% of the entire U.S. population under correctional supervision, most of them non-white. Has it ever occurred to you that the low likelihood of going to jail, either for something trivial that you did, like smoking a joint or selling one to your friend, or something you didn't do at all, is part of the invisible white privilege that surrounds us like the air we breathe, if in fact you're white? How about the likelihood of your child or your grandchild doing something stupid and being labeled a felon who can't get a job or vote for the rest of his or her life? Would the reality of that, or the fear of that, make you a little crazy? Pathology can be produced. It can be produced for the very specific purpose of making sure that Black people in this country mostly still can't mobilize as a community to claim the rights of full citizenship, can't really compete with whites who haven't been locked up, whose fathers and mothers are not locked up. And be assured of this: every parent who goes to jail represents a child's life that is pathologized by the same system. To understand the elegantly interlocking forces that sustain this new system of enforcing white privilege, this new Jim Crow, I commend to you Michelle Alexander's book, if you haven't already read it. The profits of the prison industrial complex alone constitute a daunting fortress of privilege that will need to be dismantled if we, who hope to be the advocates of justice, are not to be bought off and silenced in the face of racism's latest mutation. Alexander believes that even a complete reform of our national criminal justice system will not be adequate to eliminate the virus of racism at the heart of our culture. It will just mutate again into some other unexpected form that will take years of suffering to recognize. Perhaps she is right. I don't know how to prevent that. What I do know is that I want a government that is committed to address real crime without creating pathology. I want to be a citizen of a nation that is not complacent about the reality of what its code of law and order really stands for, and what its appetite for being tough on crime actually produces. I'm a daughter not only of the civil rights movement, but also of the Enlightenment. I will not have the sacred word justice perverted to the unholy purposes of racial oppression. I will not. Martin Luther King didn't solve the whole problem, as he would have been the first to point out. But what he did achieve was not nothing. It may not be in our hands to fix it at last for all time, but that does not excuse us from the work that lies before us in our day, today. The mass incarceration and disenfranchisement of our fellow citizens of color must not be a matter of indifference to us. In 1962, the African-American social critic James Baldwin wrote, "This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, and they do not know it and do not want to know it. It is their innocence which constitutes the crime." Pathology is being produced and lives are being destroyed on our watch and in our name. The virus of racism still thrives in our nation's culture with its toxic secretions of violence, estrangement, and despair. Our courthouses, that should be the guardians of our collective conscience, are its contamination chambers, and our prisons are its breeding grounds. Martin would have known what to do. Just as the one he looked to for inspiration and guidance once announced that his task was to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and sight for the blind, and deliverance for those in captivity. They go together, you see, For once the eyes of the blind are opened, the only thing left is to set the captives free. Shall we sing together? We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. For all these we carry in our minds and hearts until we are together again. As our elder brother Martin once said, I confess that I never intend to become adjusted to the evils of segregation and the crippling effects of discrimination and the moral degeneracy of religious bigotry and the corroding effects of a narrow sectarianism, to economic conditions that deprive men and women of work and food, to the insanities of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. Will we march only to the music of time, or will we, risking criticism and abuse, march to the soul-saving music of eternity? Human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. Amen. Go in peace.